The crystal chandeliers of the Aurelius cast their light across 17 feet of Venetian glass and Georgian silver. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan sprawled like a circuit board of ambition, towers of steel and glass competing for the sky, each one a monument to someone's hunger. Elena Vasquez moved through the room like a ghost, 24 years old, dark hair pulled back so tight it stretched the skin at her temples, white blouse pressed with military precision, the uniform of invisibility. She refilled water glasses with practiced silence, her movements choreographed to occupy as little space as possible. No one looked at her. They never did. The private dining suite cost $8,000 to reserve for an evening. Elena knew this because she'd heard the hotel manager recite the figure with reverence, as if the number itself deserved genuflection. She also knew that the men occupying the room tonight could purchase the entire hotel without disrupting their quarterly earnings reports. She positioned herself by the mahogany credenza, hands clasped, face blank, and watched. It was what she did best now. Watching, listening, becoming so unremarkable that people forgot she had ears, forgot she had eyes, forgot she was human at all. In their minds, she was furniture, a service apparatus that occasionally refreshed their Pellegrino. They didn't know about the degrees, Harvard Law, summa cum laude, a master's in corporate law from Columbia, specializing in international contract arbitration. Her thesis on cross-border merger agreements had been cited in 17 academic journals. She'd been recruited by 3 of the top 5 law firms in the country before her 23rd birthday. That was before her mother's diagnosis, before the medical bills that insurance deemed experimental treatment exclusions, before she'd watched her mother's life priced at $847,000 and found herself $412,000 short, before she'd taken out loans that charge interest rates designed by mathematical sadists, before she'd had to choose between bar exam fees and her mother's medication. Her mother had died anyway, 14 months ago. Elena still owed $389,000. The debt collectors called every morning at 7:15 a.m. She'd memorized their scripts. She'd memorized everything. It was her curse and her gift. A photographic memory that could recall entire contract clauses, legal precedents, the precise wording of judicial opinions. A mind that could parse a 200-page merger agreement in an afternoon and identify every potential liability. Now she used it to remember which guest preferred still water and which preferred sparkling. Elena adjusted a fork that didn't need adjusting and let her gaze drift to the documents spread across the dining table. It was an occupational hazard, reading everything in her field of vision. The papers were positioned carelessly, as if their contents didn't matter, as if $400 million was a sum. That warranted casual handling. She could see the header from here, Meridian Energy Acquisition Agreement. Her trained eye caught fragments, standard merger language, representations and warranties, indemnification clauses. The architecture of corporate marriage, written in the bloodless prose of attorneys billing $200 an hour. She looked away. It wasn't her world anymore. She'd surrendered her claim to it when she'd traded her future for her mother's present. The door opened. The evening was about to begin. Elena adjusted her posture, becoming smaller, less noticeable. The practiced contraction of someone who'd learned that taking up space invited scrutiny. She thought briefly of her mother, who'd taught her to stand tall, to speak clearly, to never apologize for her intelligence. Mija, Maria Elena Vasquez had said during one of their final conversations, her voice weakened by treatments that weren't working. Your mind is your inheritance, the one thing no one can take from you. Promise me you'll use it. Elena had promised. She had also discovered that promises made to the dying carry a weight that surviving alone cannot shoulder. She straightened a napkin that was already perfectly aligned and waited to become invisible again. Marcus Blackwell entered first. Elena recognized him from magazine covers and earnings reports that made financial journalists weep with envy. 63 years old, silver hair that suggested distinguished rather than old, a suit that cost more than her annual salary. CEO of Blackwell Holdings, a portfolio worth $28 billion in energy infrastructure, real estate, and the quiet kind of influence that moved governments. His handshake was economical. He didn't waste movements. Behind him came the lawyers, 3 of them, each carrying leather briefcases that probably cost more than Elena's monthly rent. They had the look of men who billed in 6-minute increments and measured their worth in billable hours. Elena knew the type. She'd been trained to become one. Then came the sellers. Gerard Fontaine swept into the room like a man accustomed to applause. French, mid-50s, with the kind of tan that came from Caribbean tax havens and Mediterranean yachts. He was the principal owner of Meridian Energy Holdings, a company that, until 18 months ago, had been a middling European energy concern. Now, according to its documentation, it controlled significant renewable energy assets across 3 continents. $400 million significant. Fontaine was accompanied by his own legal team, led by a sharp-featured man named Preston Wells, who Elena recognized as a partner at Morrison & Sterling. She'd interviewed with them once, in what felt like another lifetime. "Marcus!" Fontaine's voice carried the practiced warmth of professional charm. "A pleasure, as always. I trust the accommodations meet your standards." "The room is fine." Blackwell's tone was neutral, a man who'd learned that enthusiasm was a negotiating weakness. "Let's discuss the terms." Elena moved to pour wine. A 1982 Chateau Margaux, $3,200 a bottle. Fontaine accepted his glass without acknowledgement, as if the wine had materialized by divine providence. Blackwell waved her off. He was watching Fontaine with the careful attention of a man who'd built an empire by reading people. The documents spread across the table. Elena refilled water glasses, adjusted napkins, performed the choreography of servitude, all while her eyes drifted inevitably to the papers. She couldn't help it. Contract language was her native tongue. "The asset valuation remains as discussed," Preston Wells was saying, sliding a thick document toward Blackwell's legal team. $400 million for the complete portfolio. Wind farms in Denmark, solar installations in Portugal, hydroelectric rights in Canada. The infrastructure is state-of-the-art. The projections are conservative. One of Blackwell's lawyers, a man with tortoiseshell glasses and the permanent squint of someone who read fine print for a living, began paging through the agreement. Elena positioned herself near the credenza, ostensibly arranging appetizer plates, but her angle gave her a clear sightline to the document. The lawyer's name was Thomas Chen. She'd heard one of the others address him. He worked for Blackwell's in-house legal team, and his billing rate was probably around $800 an hour. Good, but not exceptional. The kind of lawyer who caught 90% of issues and missed the 10% that mattered most. Her brain did what it had been trained to do: absorb, analyze, categorize. Section 3.2, Representations and Warranties. Standard language regarding the accuracy of financial statements. The seller was warranting that all information provided was true, complete, and not misleading. Standard, but the devil, as always, lived in the definitions. Section 4.1, Asset Schedule. A list of properties, installations, and equipment being transferred. Wind farms across Denmark. Solar installations spanning Portugal's Alentejo region. Hydroelectric rights along Canada's Churchill River. Each one valued, documented, supposedly verified. Section 7.4, Indemnification Provisions. Boilerplate language protecting the buyer against undisclosed liabilities. The kind of clause that looked protective but could be rendered meaningless by carve-outs and exceptions buried elsewhere in the document. Everything looked correct, professional. The kind of document that 3,000 an hour law firms produced in their sleep. And yet, Elena's brow furrowed imperceptibly. Something nagged at the edge of her consciousness. A word, a phrase, a construction that didn't quite fit. She'd read thousands of contracts during her brief legal career. She'd developed an instinct for incongruity, the way a musician could detect a single wrong note in a symphony. But she was just the waitress. She was invisible. She had no business reading documents that weren't meant for her. She turned away and focused on the breadbasket. The dinner progressed through courses that cost more than Elena's weekly paycheck: seared foie gras with black truffle honey, Wagyu beef flown in from Kobe, a cheese course featuring varieties that age longer than some marriages lasted. The conversation circled the acquisition like vultures around a carcass, politely, professionally, but with unmistakable hunger. Elena served, she cleared, she poured, and she listened. "The Danish wind farms alone are worth $200 million, Fontaine was saying, gesturing with his wine glass. "The permits took years to acquire. The infrastructure is fully operational. You're purchasing revenue-generating assets from day one." Elena reached past Preston Wells to retrieve an empty plate. As she did, her eyes caught a phrase in Section 4.1.7 of the Asset Schedule. "All permits and licenses attached hereto as Exhibit C, including without limitation the operating authorization granted pursuant to Danish Energy Act. Section 12, subsection 4A. She paused. The plate hovered in her hand for a fraction of a second too long. Section 12, subsection 4A, tie. Her memory churned. She'd studied international energy regulations as part of her master's thesis on cross-border corporate acquisitions. Danish energy law had been a case study, a particularly complex regulatory framework that had tripped up several major American investors. The Danish Energy Act didn't have a Section 12. It had 12 chapters, subdivided by paragraph numbers using a completely different citation format. Danish legal documents use the term STK for subsection, not subsection, and the regulatory authority was called Energistyrelsen, not the generic Danish Energy Authority referenced elsewhere in the document. Elena had spent 3 weeks during her master's program dissecting the Danish regulatory framework. She'd read the original Danish texts, the English translations, the EU harmonization directives. She'd memorized the citation conventions the way a musician memorizes scales, through repetition, through obsession, through the kind of deep study that transforms information into instinct. Someone had written this contract using American legal conventions to describe Danish law. Someone who didn't actually know Danish law. Someone who had assumed that no one reading this contract would know Danish law either. Elena moved to the credenza, her heart beating faster. It could be nothing. A drafting error, an associate who'd been careless with citation formats. These things happened, but her instinct, the one that had made her the top student in her contracts class, the one that had caused senior partners to request her specifically for document review, that instinct was screaming. She found an excuse to pass by the table again. This time, she let her gaze linger on Section 7.8, Governing Law and Dispute Resolution. This agreement shall be governed by and construed in accordance with the laws of the state of Delaware, without regard to conflicts of law principles that would require application of the laws of another jurisdiction. Standard Delaware choice of law, nothing unusual there. But then, buried in Section 7.9, any disputes arising under this agreement shall be submitted to binding arbitration in accordance with the rules of the International Chamber of Commerce, with the seat of arbitration in Geneva, Switzerland. The arbitration panel shall consist of 3 arbitrators, with each party selecting 1 arbitrator and the 2 party-appointed arbitrators selecting the 3rd. Elena's blood ran cold. She'd seen this exact clause before. Not similar language, the exact clause, word for word, comma for comma. It had been in a case study during her corporate law seminar, a fraudulent acquisition where the arbitration clause had been deliberately designed to make it nearly impossible for the buyer to recover damages. The combination of ICC rules with a Geneva seat created a jurisdictional nightmare, astronomical arbitration costs, no appeal rights, and a procedural framework that heavily favored the seller. The case had been called Hendricks Novak, and it had resulted in a $180 million loss for the acquiring company. The seller had disappeared with the funds, protected by the very contract the buyer had signed. The case had become infamous in M&A circles, a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting foreign counterparties without proper due diligence. Elena had written a 20-page analysis of the Hendricks Novak case for her contract seminar. She'd dissected every clause, every procedural trap, every carefully constructed escape route. She'd traced the seller's assets through 17 shell companies before the trail went cold in the Seychelles. And she'd memorized the name of the lawyer who'd drafted the contract that made it all possible. The same lawyer had drafted that contract. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she arranged dessert forks. She needed to look at the signature blocks. She needed to see, there, Section 12.1, prepared by Morrison & Sterling, LLP, drafting attorney Preston Wells. The same Preston Wells who was sitting 12 feet away from her, wearing a 4,000 suit and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. The same Preston Wells who had been quietly suspended from the New York bar for 6 months following an ethics investigation. A suspension that had been sealed, that most people didn't know about, but that Elena had researched exhaustively when she was considering joining his firm. The same Preston Wells who had represented the seller in the Geneva arbitration case. Elena's mind raced through the implications. The false citation to Danish law suggested the permits might not exist, or might not be valid. The arbitration clause was designed to trap Blackwell in a forum where recovery would be virtually impossible. The entire structure of the deal was a sophisticated trap, dressed in the language of legitimate commerce. $400 million. That was the bait. Elena's mind raced through the implications, constructing the architecture of the fraud in real time. The false permit citations meant the wind farms probably didn't exist, or if they did, they weren't owned by Meridian. The arbitration clause was designed to trap Blackwell in a forum where recovery would be virtually impossible. The entire structure of the deal was a sophisticated trap, dressed in the language of legitimate commerce. She imagined what would happen if the deal closed. Blackwell would wire $400 million to Meridian's designated account, probably a shell company in the Caymans or Luxembourg. Fontaine and Wells would begin the process of making that money disappear, filtering it through layer after layer of corporate obscurity. By the time Blackwell's team realized the assets were worthless, the funds would be scattered across a dozen jurisdictions, each one with banking secrecy laws designed to protect exactly this kind of theft. And if Blackwell tried to recover his money through the arbitration clause, he'd spend 2 years and another $10 million in legal fees, fighting in a Geneva tribunal with no discovery rights and no appeals, against defendants who'd already restructured their assets to be judgment-proof. It was elegant in a terrible way. A masterpiece of legal exploitation. She looked at Marcus Blackwell, the man who'd built an empire through careful calculation, who'd survived 3 market crashes and 2 hostile takeover attempts, who was about to sign away a fortune to con artists because no one on his legal team had caught the inconsistencies, because they hadn't studied Danish energy law, because they hadn't researched Preston Wells's disciplinary history, because they were expensive, but they weren't thorough. Because Elena Vasquez, invisible waitress, was the only person in the room who knew this contract was a weapon. The pen was in Blackwell's hand. He was reaching for the signature page. Elena had perhaps 30 seconds to decide who she was. The waitress who needed this job, who couldn't afford to make waves, who had $389,000 reasons to stay invisible, or the lawyer her mother had believed in. The woman who'd graduated summa cum laude, who'd once been told by a federal judge that she had one of the sharpest legal minds he'd encountered in 40 years on the bench. She thought of her mother's voice. Your mind is your inheritance. She thought of Marcus Blackwell, a man she didn't know, whose politics she might disagree with, whose fortune had been built in ways she might find objectionable. A stranger who was about to lose $400 million to criminals because no one in his circle of expensive lawyers had bothered to learn Danish citation conventions. She thought of Preston Wells, who had already destroyed lives with this same scheme, who had been slapped on the wrist and allowed to continue practicing, who was about to do it again. Elena Vasquez made her choice. Mr. Blackwell. Her voice cut through the room like a blade through silk. Every head turned. The waitress had spoken. The furniture had developed a voice. Marcus Blackwell's pen hovered an inch above the paper, his eyes, gray and sharp and unaccustomed to interruption, fixed on Elena. I beg your pardon? Sir, before you sign, I need to ask, has your legal team verified the Danish permit citations in section 4.1.7? Silence. The kind of silence that precedes either violence or revelation. Gerard Fontaine laughed, a sharp, dismissive bark. Marcus, really? Are we taking legal advice from the help now? Preston Wells was on his feet. This is entirely inappropriate. Young lady, I don't know who you think you are. I think I'm someone who knows that the Danish Energy Act doesn't use Section 12, subsection 4A, taitai. Elena's voice was steady now, cold and precise. Danish legal citations use paragraph numbers with STK for subsection. Your document references American citation format for Danish law that doesn't exist in the form you've described. Wells' face flickered, just for a moment, but Elena caught it. Fear, recognition. This is absurd. Wells recovered quickly, his voice dripping with condescension. I've handled Danish transactions for 15 years. I can assure you... You can assure me that the regulatory authority is called Energistyrelsen, not the Danish Energy Authority you reference in Schedule C. Elena stepped forward, no longer invisible, no longer small. You can assure me that the wind farm operating permits, which supposedly attach to this agreement as Exhibit C, actually exist in the form described? Blackwell hadn't moved. His pen was still suspended over the paper, but his attention had shifted entirely to Elena. She saw calculation in his eyes, a man reassessing the landscape. Continue, he said quietly. The arbitration clause in Section 7.9. Elena's voice grew stronger. It's identical, word for word, to the clause used in the Hendricks-Novak acquisition fraud in 2019. ICC rules, Geneva seat, 3-arbitrator panel. The same structure that cost Hendricks Capital $180 million when they tried to recover assets from a fraudulent seller. She turned to face Preston Wells directly. The same clause you drafted for the seller in that case, Mr. Wells, before your 6-month suspension from the New York bar for ethics violations related to conflicts of interest. The color drained from Wells' face. Fontaine's confident smile had frozen into something rigid and artificial. "This is slander," Wells managed. "I'll have your job. I'll have you arrested for what?" Elena's eyes were blazing now. "For reading a public contract that was spread across a table in front of me, for having a memory that retains legal precedence, for recognizing your handwriting, Mr. Wells, the same distinctive clause construction, the same calculated traps, the same jurisdictional maze designed to make recovery impossible." She pointed to the asset schedule. "Pull up the Danish Energy Authority's public database. The permits referenced in Exhibit C don't exist. The wind farm installations described in Section 4.1.7 were never built. The state-of-the-art infrastructure Mr. Fontaine has been praising all evening exists only on paper. Paper your firm created to facilitate a $400 million fraud." Fontaine surged to his feet. "This is outrageous. I will not sit here and be accused by... He gestured at Elena's uniform, as if her clothing was evidence against her credibility. "By a waitress?" Elena's voice was ice. "By someone you assumed was too insignificant to read, too invisible to think." She stepped closer to the table, and for the first time, she allowed herself to take up space, to occupy the room with the presence of someone who had earned every credential, survived every hardship, and refused to be diminished by the opinions of men who measured worth in designer labels. "I've read more contracts than you've signed, Mr. Fontaine. I've analyzed more merger agreements than your entire legal team combined, and I know fraud when I see it, because I was trained by some of the best legal minds in the country to recognize exactly the kind of sophisticated deception you're attempting here tonight." Blackwell set down his pen. "Thomas." His voice was quiet, controlled, the calm before the storm. "Verify her claims, now." The lawyer with tortoiseshell glasses was already on his phone, typing furiously. The room hung suspended in terrible silence as he navigated to the Danish regulatory database. Elena watched Fontaine. The Frenchman's composure was crumbling, his eyes darting toward the door, his hand gripping his wineglass so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "Mr. Blackwell?" Thomas looked up from his phone, his face ashen. "The permits? They're not in the database. The registration numbers in Exhibit C don't correspond to any valid authorizations. And the wind farm coordinates..." He swallowed. "They're in the middle of the North Sea. There's nothing there." Fontaine bolted for the door. He made it 3 steps before Blackwell's security detail materialized from the hallway. 2 men in dark suits, the kind whose muscles suggested expensive gyms and specialized training. "Sit down, Mr. Fontaine." Blackwell's voice was ice. "We have a great deal to discuss." Preston Wells was ashen now, his earlier bluster completely evaporated. I had no idea. The documentation was provided by the client. I simply drafted..." "You drafted identical fraud architecture to a case you were sanctioned for 3 years ago." Elena's voice was merciless. "The New York bar may have sealed your disciplinary records, but I read the case files when they were public. I know exactly what you did, Mr. Wells, and I know what you're doing now." She turned to Blackwell. "I'd recommend contacting the FBI's white-collar crime division. The wire fraud statutes alone carry sentences up to 20 years. Given the international nature of the scheme, there may also be FCPA violations worth investigating." Blackwell stared at her, as if seeing her for the first time, which, in a sense, he was. "Who," he said slowly, "are you?" The next 45 minutes were a controlled demolition. Blackwell's security team detained both Fontaine and Wells, while his lawyers documented everything. Phones were confiscated. The FBI was contacted. A forensic accountant was summoned to begin tracing the shell companies that would have received the $400 million. Ozdar's a Byzantine network of offshore entities registered in the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, and the British Virgin Islands. Elena stood apart from the chaos, watching as the carefully constructed fiction of Meridian Energy Holdings collapsed in real time. She felt strange, detached somehow, as if observing herself from a great distance. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion. Elena watched as Gerard Fontaine, who had entered the room like a king, was escorted out in handcuffs. His face had aged a decade in an hour. The tan now looked sallow, the confidence replaced by the hollow terror of a man who knew his life was over. He said nothing as he passed her. He didn't even look at her. Perhaps he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge that his empire had been toppled by someone he'd considered beneath notice. Preston Wells fared no better. His protests grew increasingly desperate, claims of innocence, assertions that he'd been deceived by his client, threats of lawsuits that everyone in the room knew were meaningless. When the FBI agents arrived, he was still talking, his voice rising toward hysteria. "I'm a partner at Morrison & Sterling. Do you know who my clients are? I'll have your badges." The FBI agent, a woman with short gray hair and the patient demeanor of someone who'd heard every excuse, simply recited his rights and guided him toward the door. The other lawyers from Morrison & Sterling were already distancing themselves, making hurried phone calls, no doubt preparing the firm's response to what would be a career-ending scandal for their colleague. Elena stood by the credenza, suddenly uncertain. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her exhausted and acutely aware that she'd just destroyed her own employment by drawing attention to herself in the most spectacular way possible. She'd saved Marcus Blackwell $400 million. She'd probably also gotten herself fired from a waitressing job she desperately needed. The debt collectors would call tomorrow at 7:15 a.m. They always did. The room had emptied. The FBI had taken their prisoners. The lawyers had dispersed to their damage control. Only Marcus Blackwell remained, standing by the windows, watching the city lights far below. Elena was gathering her things, the tray, the napkins, the small detritus of servitude, when his voice stopped her. "You haven't answered my question." She turned. Blackwell hadn't moved, but his eyes were on her now, appraising, curious, seeing her perhaps for the first time since she'd entered the room 4 hours ago. "Who are you?" he repeated. Elena set down the tray. "Elena Vasquez, Harvard Law, class of 2021, Columbia LLM in corporate law, 2022. I specialized in cross-border mergers and international contract arbitration." She paused. "I was supposed to join Sullivan & Cromwell. I had offers from 3 other top 10 firms. What happened?" The question was simple. The answer was anything but. Elena had told this story before, to loan officers, to debt collectors, to the bureaucratic machinery of financial ruin. Each time she'd flattened it into facts and figures, stripped of emotion, reduced to data points. But something in Blackwell's voice, the genuine curiosity perhaps, or maybe just her own exhaustion, made her tell the truth. "My mother was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer during my last semester at Columbia." Elena's voice was steady, but her hands had started to tremble. The treatment her oncologist recommended was experimental, immunotherapy combined with targeted radiation. The clinical trials showed a 34% improvement in survival rates. Insurance wouldn't cover it. They called it not medically necessary, as if my mother's life was a luxury feature. She paused, gathering herself. "I took out loans. Private loans, the kind with interest rates that should be illegal, the kind that compound daily, that add fees to fees, that turn a desperate daughter into a perpetual debtor. I deferred everything, the bar exam, the job offers, the life I was supposed to have. I thought if I could just get her through the treatment, I could rebuild later." She looked at the city lights, unable to meet his eyes. "She died anyway, 14 months ago. The treatment gave her 8 extra months, and I'm grateful for every one of them. We had time to say goodbye, time for her to see me graduate, time for the conversations we'd always postponed." Elena's voice cracked. "I still owe $389,000. I couldn't afford the bar exam fees, couldn't afford to take time off to study. So, I work here. I work doubles when I can get them. I send money to the collectors and watch the interest accumulate faster than I can pay it down. And every morning at 7:15, my phone rings, and someone reads from a script about payment arrangements while I calculate how many shifts I'd need to work to pay off the interest alone." Silence stretched between them. "My wife died of cancer," Blackwell said quietly. 12 years ago. Ovarian. She was 43. Elena looked at him. The mask of the billionaire had slipped, revealing something human beneath, grief that time had softened but never erased. "I'm sorry," she said. "So am I, for what you've been through." He turned to face her fully. "You just saved me $400 million, probably more when you factor in the reputational damage of being publicly defrauded. You did it using knowledge that my entire legal team, billing me collectively about $40,000 an hour, failed to apply." Elena said nothing. "I've built my career on recognizing value that others overlook." Blackwell's voice was thoughtful now. "I've made my fortune by seeing what's invisible to everyone else. And I've never, not once in 40 years, seen anything quite like what you just did. I want to offer you a position." Elena blinked. "I'm not licensed to practice law, Mr. Blackwell. I told you, I never took the bar." "Then we'll fix that." His voice carried the certainty of a man who'd spent decades making the impossible happen through sheer force of will. full salary while you study, bar prep courses, the best ones, and when you pass, a position on my internal legal team, not as a junior associate, as head of contract forensics. Elena's heart stopped. Contract forensics? A new division? You'd build it from the ground up. Blackwell was pacing now, the entrepreneur's energy visible in every movement. Every major deal Blackwell Holdings considers, you'd review it. Your job would be to find what everyone else misses, the hidden traps, the jurisdictional loopholes, the fraud buried in footnotes. He stopped in front of her. Starting salary of $450,000 plus a $500,000 signing bonus. Equity participation in any deal where your analysis prevents a loss. Full benefits, medical, dental, vision, the works. Access to our legal library, our research teams, our networks, and... He paused. Complete payoff of your existing debt, all of it, immediately, not a loan, not an advance against salary, a clean slate. Elena's vision blurred. She realized distantly that she was crying. $389,000. Gone. The weight that had crushed her for 14 months, that had transformed every sunrise into a reminder of her failure, that had reduced a Harvard law graduate to serving bread baskets to billionaires. Gone. Erased, as if it had never existed. She thought of the 7:15 a.m. phone calls that would stop coming, the interest calculations she'd done in the dark of sleepless nights, the shame she'd felt every time a former classmate recognized her uniform and looked away. Too embarrassed to acknowledge her. Gone. All of it. Why? Her voice cracked. You don't know me. You have no reason to. I know enough. Blackwell's voice was gentle now. I know that brilliance doesn't disappear just because circumstances force it into hiding. I know that the world is full of invisible people whose talents are wasted because no one bothers to look. And I know that tonight you could have stayed silent. You could have watched me sign that contract, collected your tip, and walked away. Instead, you risked everything, your job, your reputation, possible legal retaliation, to prevent a fraud against a stranger. He extended his hand. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are. Elena looked at his hand. The hand of a man worth $28 billion offered in partnership to a waitress who'd been invisible until an hour ago. She wiped her eyes, straightened her spine, and took his hand. I have conditions. Blackwell's eyebrows rose. Go on. Full autonomy in my division. No interference from your current legal team. They missed this, and I won't have them second-guessing my methods. Direct reporting to you. No intermediaries. Done. And one more thing. Elena's voice steadied. A scholarship fund. For law students whose parents are diagnosed with terminal illnesses, full tuition coverage and living expenses for anyone who has to choose between their education and their family. Nobody should have to make that choice. Nobody should have to watch their dreams die because they chose love over ambition. Blackwell was quiet for a moment. Elena watched his face, the way his jaw tightened, the slight glisten in his eyes that he blinked away. Named after your mother? The Maria Elena Vasquez Legal Scholars Fund. Her voice broke slightly on her mother's name. She never got to see me practice law. She never got to see me argue a case or close a deal or do any of the things she sacrificed for. But maybe her name can help someone else's child do what I couldn't. Elena wiped her eyes. So no one else has to make the choice I made. So no one else has to learn what I learned, that the world doesn't care how brilliant you are when the bills come due. Marcus Blackwell, the man who'd built an empire on calculating every advantage, who'd never made a business decision based on sentiment, who had weathered decades of corporate warfare with cold rationality, smiled. It was a genuine smile, the first she'd seen from him all evening. My wife would have liked you, he said quietly. She always said I was too focused on the numbers, that I needed people around me who saw the humanity behind the spreadsheets. He straightened his posture, businesslike again, but with a warmth that hadn't been there before. Consider it endowed, $10 million to start. We'll grow it from there. I want the first scholarships awarded by next fall. Full tuition, living expenses, bar prep courses, everything. And I want you to chair the selection committee. They shook hands again, not as employer and employee, but as partners, as equals. As two people who had each lost someone they loved and found, in this unlikely moment, a way to transform that loss into something lasting. Outside the windows, Manhattan glittered with 10 million lights, each one a story, each one a struggle, each one a person carrying dreams that the world might never notice. Elena Vasquez had been invisible for 14 months. Tonight, she became unstoppable. Narrator, soft, reflective. In every room of power, there is someone who is meant to be invisible. The server, the assistant, the person whose job is to exist in margins and shadows. We assume their silence means they have nothing to say. We assume their service means they have nothing to offer. We assume their position reflects their worth. We are almost always wrong. Elena Vasquez had a photographic memory, 2 advanced degrees, and 14 months of grief compressed into a debt that felt like a life sentence. She had been ignored, dismissed, forgotten by a world that measures human value in titles and bank balances. She had served wine to men who wouldn't remember her name. She had cleared plates for people who looked through her as if she were made of glass. She had smiled through condescension and maintained composure through casual cruelty. The daily indignities that invisibility requires, but knowledge doesn't disappear just because the world refuses to see it. Brilliance doesn't diminish just because it's forced to wear a servant's uniform. And courage, the kind that makes someone risk everything to stop an injustice, that courage lives in people no one thinks to look at twice. Tonight, a waitress saved a billionaire from a $400 million fraud. Tomorrow, she'll begin building a department that will protect countless others from the same fate. And in a few years, students carrying burdens like hers will receive scholarships bearing her mother's name, a legacy of love transformed into opportunity. And somewhere out there, another invisible person is watching, waiting, carrying brilliance that the world hasn't bothered to notice yet. The question isn't whether they exist. The question is whether we have the wisdom to see them before they save us from ourselves.